Hi, it's Steve Hargadon. I'm here with Mary Linaberger. Welcome.
Okay, I'm so excited. I'm sorry.
About what?
Oh, just the sessions I went to. I'm sure that everybody else was too.
Good. Well, this is the closing keynote, but it's in the form of a conversation about what we feel like we've learned today. I took so many notes. I was just sort of stunned by the way in which the conversations opened up for me, lots of good thinking and ways for me to think about how to move forward. I don't run a micro school. I'm interested in the positive benefits of micro schools, um, but I'm sort of interested in the kinds of things we can do to be supportive of changing how we think about schooling. So let me do this. I'm going to pull up the chat and the participant list. If you have a question or you want to make a comment, please feel free to do so in the chat.
I'll tell you what I'd love is if you went to a session and there was some really amazing takeaway that you want to share with us. I'd love to hear that. Um, yeah.
You're
So, I mean,
asking you're asking the participants. So
yep.
please
Yep.
put in the
Participants,
chat.
please tell us whose session you went to and what was the biggest takeaway that you got. I got to listen to Henry, and I was thrilled to get to listen to Henry talk. Steve, the thing that I think, and I know a lot about summer help, but it's a totally different thing to get to hear someone who was a student who now leads that mission on behalf of his grandfather and his mother and will probably inherit that school. Um,
Mhm.
talk so eloquently about play and democracy and social and emotional learning, and that learning of any kind of content is absolutely secondary to that.
Interesting.
I don't know that we see that much here in the US, except for maybe in our Sudbury schools or our democratic free schools. In the liberated learners networks, yes. I mean, in our micro schools, we do. But in our big public systems, I can't even fathom what it would be like to have a place where their free play was the highest priority.
Yeah, and so we got a comment from Candace. Her session was Tasha Rings using her nearby university community.
Yeah. Yeah. Tell us more about that, Candace. What is exactly that she's doing? How is she collaborating with the university? I mean, I've seen it in some of the school owners I've worked with. I had a gal in California who partnered with UC Berkeley, and their staff would actually teach her kids who were exceptionally gifted, profoundly gifted, like 150 IQs and higher. So these kids were actually working at a university level as kids in junior high school level, classes. I'll tell you what else stuck out for me with what Henry said was that there's so much time because most of the kids who attend Summerhill attend as boarding school students, and it's an international group, but because they're there 24/7, there is this luxury of time. Learning doesn't have to happen on a bell schedule in a certain amount of time because there's this luxury of lots of time to let them be kids and to come to the choice to have direct instruction or specific learning happen when they decide. So lots of agency.
So Kevin Kelly wrote a book years ago called What Technology Wants. And I think I'm remembering correctly that he sort of makes the point that there are things that grow and that grow because they have needs and they get fulfilled. And it's not conscious decision making by the individuals in the system. It's that the entity or the infrastructure or the idea sucks up something and then produces energy and grows. And so there's this sort of interesting question of we can see all of these really good things like time, but giving students time isn't necessarily going to grow the the popularity or the system of that school,
Mhm.
right? Getting good, getting into good colleges, getting into learning to do things that will be useful in the workplace. Those are things that probably are more likely to produce growth, whereas we might say they're not as healthy. But the time thing seems brilliant. But I also can see you could say that would be really hard to see it um, precipitating growth?
Well, I mean, I think that the experience at Summerhill is contrary to what you're saying. What's probably salient to say is that it takes a really specific kind of parent to trust that system. And in fact, when Henry talked about it, he said that they're first and foremost, they trust children to be responsible for their own learning. But in order to do that, they have to get the parent to trust Summerhill School. And so they do spend a good bit of time working with parents to get them to release those children into that environment, into that community. And that is the other big chunk he talked about was their democratic process. And it was funny, he told us that Summerhill the kids have written something like 400 laws to govern the school, which sounds like a lot of micromanagement, but the children have written all the laws. And a lot of them are very simple laws about, like he explained, don't wear tennis shoes on the trampoline. But because they've written those laws, they abide by those laws, and they have democratic processes to handle when somebody doesn't follow them. And it's not punitive, but rather just a statement of, you violated this rule that we all agreed to. We don't like that you did that. It has consequences. We still like you as a person. And I think so much of the corrections that we do to students in the bigger systems of school feel punitive. They make kids feel demoralized, drained. They feel less than, like they take them on as personal affronts to who they are.
Let's bookmark that.
Yeah.
And when we come back to it, I want to ask if Prenda has figured out the growth formula.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So here's what we heard. We got we heard some good things. So Tasha's using the College of Education to assist and support her school. I think that's amazing. Plus there's this reciprocal thing that's got to be happening where young teachers are learning or seeing what's possible beyond a traditional teaching position. Ms. Wu went to Awakening Spirit School. She said the best thing was that Amy uses tuition. She has a high tuition, but she's got a sliding scale because she has high tuition, and that parents are allowed to barter dollar for dollar against their child's tuition with hours or services or resources that the school has actually listed that they need. Okay, Joe had takeaways. Presenters are walking their talk. Did you hear that, Steve?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That's one of the things I love the most about the microschools movement. I go out and present and talk in different places. I'll jump into social media places like Clubhouse, where everybody's talking about the education revolution or the learning revolution, like your organization spearheads. So many people are talking about it, but they're not doing anything about it. And yes, tonight we're just talking about it, but everybody we had here is doing something, including you and I. Like, we're taking action on the things that we think are important.
So I am curious. Go ahead.
Joe said the speakers tonight run on their passion more than stable systems. Their passion creates value in the movement. And the belief in the child means don't think you are the one making their life happen. That's powerful, Joe. Thank you for that.
So I'm curious about the way in which we, with Michael Strong, we talked about the food analogy or metaphor. Again, this idea of lots of small independent restaurants, lots of different kinds of foods. But you think about what it takes to become a chain, right? And this the standardization and probably the lowering of quality in order to match the needs of the growth. So it is a really interesting question of, do micro schools actually hold the potential to change how we feel about schooling, or are they small pockets of people doing good things that have been done for decades, if not centuries, that are unlikely to actually inform the system as a whole?
Well, the way that I approached it, the way that I always approach it when I thought through harnessing myself to this movement and saying all the skill sets I have as an administrator with a superintendent's license, what could I do that would be alternative? I was convinced that the best way to make change was outside of the system, because I tried doing it inside and failed. And that I like the analogy of yoga coming to the West. So if you think about it was, in like what the 70s and 80s that a lot of the yogis came from India and began to open centers here in the US, and they trained a whole generation of yoga practitioners. And now like yoga is this very ubiquitous thing. I would challenge you to go to any town in the US and not find a yoga studio, someone teaching, practicing yoga. And now it's online. So, over time, and now we have yoga in the schools. That's where the point was going. I think that when you can actually have a mass quantity of small schools that are demonstrating the actual daily implementation of best practices, big systems of education will have to take notice. And what they will likely do is they will borrow the ideas, which, I always heard this, like if people steal your ideas, that's the highest form of flattery. And in the end, if the ideas are actually implemented with fidelity, that's what means more than, somebody's taking your ideas.
So Olivia says she appreciates that we're trying to create a community for microschool builders. It's an incredibly lonely road. Trailblazing is hard. I think more of these kinds of sessions with more of a global reach would be helpful to many.
Good. That's what we were thinking, Olivia. I mean, honestly, full transparency. Steve and I have been talking about this for years. And because of Steve's global vision, he's been helping me to reframe my thinking. And this was a test. We wanted to see, do people actually want to talk about small schools, about actually building them, creating them to make real change versus just talking about it?
Yeah, and I at least feel like I was fully satisfied with the conversation today.
Mm-hmm.
But I also recognize that my audience is largely teachers and librarians. And so probably a very small percentage of them are even sort of thinking about micro schools as an idea.
Yeah. Well, I said in the first panel, the big opening panel, the way I look at it is there's this diffusion of innovation scale. I mentioned it. It's a bell curve, and any new thing that you want to do in the world tends to follow that. So there's the people at the very tail end, the front tail end, are called the early adopters. Actually, they're the innovators, right before the early adopters. I think that when I think about the alternative education movement, which is the grandfather of this movement, those were those people. They were the people who were the geese at the head of the V breaking the wind. And I think that the microschools movement now has much more speed and momentum. Kelly's very miraculous sort of growth and development with Prenda is possible because of the Summer Hills, the democratic free schools, the Waldorf, the Montessori's, all of those. That was a generation ago, wasn't it? Or 100 years ago, a century ago, that a lot of those thinkers got their start with their unique schools. Many of them grew into networks of schools, and the models have slowly gained popularity. And now I think with the pandemic, there's much more awareness of real need for a larger population of students to have these kinds of unique, bespoke learning environments.
Yeah. So one of the things that Kelly said was, he called them learning guides. And you and I have talked about them as learning coaches. Mm-hmm. But this idea that there's also, potentially a place, Tom saying there's a massive exodus of teachers leaving education when they really just want to leave school and don't know where else to go. Right. And is there some middle ground between leaving school as a teacher and starting a micro school? Is there a place for becoming a learning coach or a learning guide where you help families sort of navigate the system?
I think it's possible. I see out there in all of the channels that I follow, lots and lots of teachers are starting small businesses of their own, doing a wide variety of things, from selling things on Etsy to teachers pay teachers to writing digital courses, and those digital courses or tutoring. I've seen a couple people start out with just tutoring themselves. And I know one gal in particular that I've met grew her tutoring business. She now has an international small school, and she just got some award from Meta for her innovation. So, you look at that and you see a teacher saying, I still have to serve kids. I'm not ready to lay down and die. What can I do that's different, that would bring, and the real difference here, Steve, is it brings you joy, to like not Marie Kondo it. I built micro school builders because I wanted to use all the skill sets I had accumulated, but I wanted to use it in a more creative, positive way than I was able to do in my public school administrative job. You know, my business is a bespoke business. I think there are many teachers who are ready to do something with their skills, their abilities, and their passions, other than just be an employee of a big system.
Did you have any personal epiphany moments, Mara?
Most of my epiphanies came listening to Henry talk. The fact that they put their trust in the child, that was A.S. Neal's founding philosophy, that we could actually allow children, he didn't go into the details. My guess is the caring adults are there to watch and guide and steward these children and make sure that they're not getting into harm. But beside that they really are allowing kids to be kids. He talked about the use of screens, and that our equivalent would be their use of technology and devices here in the US, and that the kids wrote the laws regarding that, and that it has grown and changed. Those laws have changed. But he said, where he was using an Atari system when he was attending Summerhill, the kids have chosen now to not use their devices during the day between the hours of 5 a.m. and 4 p.m. They've written that into their law. There are exceptions to that if you're using the technologies for your learning. But he was saying, okay, AI is coming. He finds it kind of scary. And what he knows is the kids at Summerhill, because they trust them, they will actually tackle that. They'll be the ones who will explore AI. They'll be the ones who make mistakes with AI, and they'll be the ones who actually lead us forward in the use of AI. That was kind of an aha for me, that he was going to say, I don't want to have anything to do it, but I trust these learners that we've empowered to actually figure out for all of us what we should be doing with artificial intelligence. I can't imagine a school district say that they're going to allow the kids to figure out AI. Can you?
No.
No.
I'm interested in Stu Wagner said that he's retired and moved to coaching, virtual coaching. Mm-hmm. I'd be really interested in hearing more about that, Stu, and we can promote you here and let you talk, or you can put a note in the chat. Let us know.
I've seen that starting to pop up in my experience too. There are more people who are going into the coaching realm. I have some reservations about it, because the life coaching industry is taking some major hits right now. Sort of this notion that it's snake oil sales, and I'd hate to see educators go off into becoming a student coach. Maybe with that terminology, just because I don't want them to get caught up in the backlash around an unregulated industry. Now, I don't know how people feel about that, because do we want more regulation or do we not? And at the end of the day, I tend to believe it's all perfect. People get the experiences that are there to either help them grow or learn something. So, Stu, what do you think?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. I really, as a quote unquote retired, I have 20 something years of teaching, mostly special ed. And I was lucky enough to, my oldest son we lived in Virginia for a while, to a community school, it was called. And it was very Montessori-esque, up to 8th grade. And, portfolios, the children led their meetings for parent teacher conferences. At the end of the year, we had a celebration, which was a big art show and talent show and, kind of thing to celebrate the year of learning. And it completely changed how I saw education. And this is like my, 4th year into teaching. He was young. He was very young. So anyway, now I'm back in New York because that's where I grew up, and Mom was getting old and, needed to come be with family. And I was teaching special ed up here at private day school, level 3 autism. Everybody was using technology to speak with if they could, nonverbal things of that nature. But I just got burnt, just the rigmarole. And this was I stayed in private schools for years because I hated public school. At least I had a little more autonomy when I was in a private day school. But it just became too much. When the COVID hit, I had a class that necessitated about 10 adults for 8 learners. that the severity of it. And we had about 5 adults on a good day. We were down like 40 staff in the building. And it just went crazy. So I wound up, my wife was like, "You're bringing it home with you. It's too much." I had my nose broken last summer, but I let it slide because these things happen when you work with teenage boys. But anyway, so now, since November, I've been looking and working and trying to, I fell into tutoring because I got to pay some money, but coaching is much more my field because I realized, although I was teaching, I've always been coaching learners. I always believe every teacher should be a special ed teacher because I think everybody should be individualizing education for kids and not, cookie cuttering it. So I was leaning on that, but then I wanted to do more coaching, but like you're saying, it's snake oil and people aren't sure if it's good or not. And there's no real credentialing for it. So, I call myself, when people ask what I do, I'll say, I'm an education coach. But really I'm focusing on executive function and ADHD coaching, which typically will be ADHD and, autism spectrum disorder, because it's just what I'm strong at. I've been in that field for years. And so I'm going to lean toward that way. And there's a very big need for it. It's just that, that's the only way I can look at it. But like life coaching, I'm taking a course now just to get familiar with, the concepts and be able to talk the talk. But, it's not regulated. So what does that mean? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, it's a scary thing to go out regulated. Still keeping all my credentials, to say I have something. So
yeah, Steve,
so
I think
that's
this would be one of those things we could do that would be an interesting follow-up. I know we're starting to think about what are some other topics that we could bring in an additional summit to talk about the movement and parts of it. And so that sort of coaching aspect, because that sort of fits in with the guides. I know I have one of my owners, Steve, wrestles with how do you train people to be guides. And I know Amy, who was in one of our sessions, she spends a good bit of time. She likes having parents as guides because she's able to shape them in the processes that she has chosen for her school. I saw something really neat that Joe Pound said, and Joe is actually running the Forest School Institute. I think I got that right, Joe. You'll have to tell me if I butchered that. And he and I have talked before, but he said he thinks that the teacher exodus is actually getting people where they can best contribute, so that like not everybody needs to be a formal educator, and that if teaching is your passion, you'll always find a way to be using that. That communities should be full of teachers who are reaching out. And he quoted Viktor Frankl, "What man needs is not a tensionless state, but the striving and struggling of a worthy goal." So, I mean, I kind of think that way too. If you get into a crisis in your teaching job, which I did, that forced me to innovate. So maybe we don't need to fix things. I don't know.
My epiphany today was the reminder that replacing one system with another, or one set of beliefs about school with another set of beliefs, doesn't actually likely change things. Meaning, I can look at the school system and say, I think that this should be taught or that should be taught, and there should be more play and the like. But I don't think that trading of one set of beliefs about what school should be for another set of beliefs will actually change the system. I'm interested in how do you cultivate the process of change? What would you do to actually create a generative system that reinvented itself at some level on a regular basis, in the same way that when you go into a city, you're going to have a city that has a ton of really good small restaurants, and you go into another city and it's a food desert. So what does that one city do that makes it so easy or better for innovation within the food system that the other city isn't doing? It reminded me of my curiosity about that question.
Yeah, I don't know that I have an answer. I have some guesses, but I think it's more complex than you think and simpler than you think. It's the culture, it's the community, it's the creativity of the people who are there. And then at the end of the day, the truth is, a school only stays open, a micro school only stays open if the customers show up and pay the tuition. Even in Kelly's case, if students don't show up, that little location of 10 kids and a parent aren't going to continue to stay open. So, I think a lot about what creates longevity in your parallel to the food, restaurants, bespoke restaurants. what keeps them going is the stories people tell that carry on the legacy, you know.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, school has a deeper, more profound kind of shadow on all of us than restaurants do. Meaning, we can think of restaurant innovation and restaurants opening and closing, and we don't stress out. But the idea that a school would open or close and students would get stranded or they wouldn't be well prepared hits us at a different emotional level.
Yeah.
So it's harder.
Well, Joe said, thanks to us for following our promptings, the guests were sources of light. Thank you for amplifying their voices. I think about that a lot. And when I work with clients, I speak very strongly to legacy. It's not that they're going to necessarily be able to keep their school open as long as Henry has in his grandfather's legacy. But I think about children being empowered in the way that microschools empower them as agents of their own learning, being self-directed, having freedom, having time, being given the ability to play and to stay a child. And then I think about what happens to that child if they're forced, not of their own choice, if they're forced to go back to a system that doesn't support those skill sets. And I go back to, I was teaching in the public schools and I was the director of staff development, and I went into a school where teachers were innovating with students on the spectrum. They had them doing calisthenics, and there was a teacher who let kids get up and self-regulate in her classroom by doing calisthenics at stations in the room. It was powerful. So these kids would notice they were dysregulated or unable to pay attention, and they could do push-ups on their desk, without disrupting the classroom. And I asked this teacher what happens when they go to the next school, because they went on for 4th grade, and she didn't have an answer. So we had a long conversation about the need to communicate that empowerment of those children to the next group of receiving teachers so that those kids wouldn't become angry, bitter, resentful of the fact that their liberties have been taken away. So I think no matter what we do with this movement, we have to be thinking about keeping these things going so that kids still have access to them.
Mara, thank you for being such a thoughtful and passionate promoter of microschools.
It's my
this
pleasure.
has been a really fun event. I'm really excited to have the recordings up and available for people in the future, and we'll look to do another one soon.
Thanks all of you for coming. Help spread the word, please, and tell people. I think, follow up with us and let us know if there are things that you want to talk about further. I mean, some of the ideas we've had are, how do you, the nitty gritty, how do you actually open something and get it to stay open? What does it look like? What are the similarities and differences between what a microschool does and what a traditional school does? Where's this movement going? Are we going to be satisfied with continuing to open lots and lots of small schools, or are we interested in really reshaping what education looks like at a local level or a national level or even a global level? And then if that's what we're really doing, what does that mean? What action steps do we have to take together and collectively? So, tonight we had Prenda, and we had Summerhill, and we had Microschool Builders, and we had Learning Revolution. So all coming together to work to present this event. I think it's a good model for all of the microschools coming together to work with for common goals.
Good.
Lots
I
of
think
really
we're
good
done.
comments coming. Lots of last minute comments coming about just this was useful. People enjoyed this. The guests we had were people that everybody else wanted to sit down to dinner with, Steve. So thank you for that prompting.
Right. Okay, what a lot of fun.
Yep.
Thanks, Mara. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Be well.
Bye now. Yes, and I will post the chat logs as well as the recordings.
Very good. I'm so glad that Peggy asked that at the end. Yes, the commentary was spectacular. It will all be recorded.